Bring John into the conversation. A lot to get to today, John. Injury, big injury, which doesn't seem – sometimes the little guys, when they get hurt, doesn't get as a lot of attention because they're not big-time. You know, when Lane Johnson gets suspended, that's a big deal. Then the replacement is a big deal. But a guy like Ron Brooks gets hurt. It seems like, Ron Brooks, you can replace him easily. And you wonder how much – because the defense was really good yesterday, how much is losing a guy like Ron Brooks disrupt the defense that played really well yesterday?
I think it hurts. He played a very important position, obviously, in today's game, a nickel cornerback, which is basically a starter, because you're going to play your nickel guy more than your third linebacker, and that's how things shook out this season. So you're losing a starting player. Yesterday, it didn't affect the Eagles all that much. They moved Malcolm Jenkins down to the slot, put Jalen Watkins in at safety, and, hey, it doesn't matter who they threw out there yesterday. The pass rush was so good, it wasn't going to have an impact. But looking down the line, when you're facing, it starts this week on Sunday night against the Dallas Cowboys, you're not going to have that same kind of pass rush. So the back end's going to hold up a little bit better, and when you lose players who are starters for you, obviously it's going to affect you.
John, obviously, when you mentioned Brooks out, means somebody else has to step up. I think one thing that's under the radar here is McKelvin, who has not played a lot all year. What is the plan moving forward with Brooks out? How are they, how do we see the back end of that secondary looking now?
Well, it's most likely going to be, at least at first, what it was yesterday when he got hurt early in the game, and that's the fact that Leotis and Nolan will continue to play on the outside. In nickel, Malcolm will slip down and play the nickel corner, and then Jalen Watkins will enter the game at safety. Now, the problem with that is, besides the fact that Malcolm can struggle at times against really, really quick slot receivers, then you bring Jalen in, who doesn't have a ton of experience. So you could also put Jalen Mills on the field at slot cornerback if you want to keep Malcolm at safety. So it all depends on what Jim wants to do. But the reality is Leotis has a history of injuries, and it goes far back before this hamstring. So it's tough to imagine a guy like that lasting till the end of the season with no hiccups. You hope for it, but the reality is there's just not a lot of depth with the Eagles at the cornerback position. There wasn't a lot of depth before Ron got hurt, and there's even less. Obviously, you have C.J. Smith. They'll try to get him up to speed. Aaron Grimes was in today for a physical. We'll see if they bring him back. But it's a position that's a concern.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. Ron Brooks ruptured his right quad tendon. He's out for the year. Eagles now scrambling around to figure out what they'll do there. You got Benny Logan, who didn't play yesterday, but that front four didn't seem like they missed a beat without him. We knew going into this game the Vikings' weak spot was their offensive line. They were hideous yesterday, but a lot of credit goes to the Eagles' game plan. Jim Schwartz, I guess he was not happy hearing his name being drugged through the mud a little bit, and he seemed like he coached that game with a chip on his shoulder.
Jim Schwartz embarrassed Norv Turner, and I often joke that I'm not a big Norv guy, but I often joke it's an indictable offense to criticize Norv Turner in this league as an offensive coordinator, but he got waxed, and he didn't adjust at all. And basically it was his own blitz, and the theory is that, you know, if you watch Jim for any amount of time, he doesn't blitz a ton. He doesn't want to blitz a ton. He blitzed more yesterday than he has the rest of the season, although it still wasn't an abnormally high number. I think it was 13 or 14 times. But that's a lot for the Eagles. And they backed it up with a zone drop, usually on the other side. And all week leading up to this game, we talked about the familiarity and whether it would matter or not. Well, it didn't matter that Sam was familiar with the defense. It mattered that the defense was familiar with Sam because they knew he didn't like those looks. Basically rolled coverage. away from the blitz, and Sam couldn't figure it out. He held the ball a tick too long, and then the pass rush was there because the tackles, as you mentioned, Mike, were egregious for the Vikings. A lot of it has to do if you rewind 1 week to Big V in Washington. I told you during the week, it's a big difference for an offensive tackle with no experience playing at home versus the road. You saw Vaitai was fine yesterday. He wasn't great, but he's fine. You don't have to worry about the silent counts. You don't have to worry about the noise when you're home. You get off the ball a tick faster. You saw the exact opposite for the Vikings' young tackles. They had to worry about the noise, had to worry about the silent counts, and it was like there were two Vaitais on the field for the Vikings.
They were bad. Long was awful. There's no two ways about it. He was terrible in the snaps that he got. In fact, there was one time where he actually sacked Sam Bradford. He was so bad. I mean, it was hideous to watch their offensive line, and you wonder,
And by the way, Jake Long was only out there for 13 snaps. You would think he was out there for 40, or because he was so bad, he showed up. But that tells you the Vikings just brought in Jake Long. At one time, he's a very good player, number 1 overall pick in the draft. I think he's a 4-time Pro Bowler. But he was on the street because of 2 consecutive ACL tears, sort of like Sam. And he clearly wasn't ready to play. But that's how little regard they have for Clemmings and Surlis, who were every bit as bad as Jake Long.
Yeah, and my question was really geared towards that's a 5-0 Minnesota team. I think a lot of us thought was a Super Bowl contender, and I don't think that one game takes you out of that. But it goes to show, again, the inconsistencies that occur in this league that make you look like you did for 2 weeks against Detroit and Washington. Not that you looked like a Super Bowl contender yesterday, but that's a pretty good team that the Eagles defensively dominated anyway. What do you take from that? What can we take from yesterday's game, which was ugly?
Well, I think the biggest positive for the Eagles is Lincoln Financial Field is turning out to be a really significant home field advantage for the first time in a long time. They played 3 games there. They've blown everybody out. You could ignore Cleveland. That's understandable. But then they just waxed Pittsburgh and Minnesota. In theory, certainly 2 playoff contenders, and some people will say 2 Super Bowl contenders. Hey, they're playing well at home. And if they continue to play well at home and make it that difficult, well, the Eagles are going to be in the conversation till the end. It's difficult to play on the road in this league. And I often think fans don't think about it, don't realize how much of a difference it is. And that's why you see the difference from how they played in Washington and how they played yesterday.
Sure is. And look, when you can steal a game or 2 on the road, you got to try to do it. And the Eagles could have stole a game in Detroit. They could have stole a game in Washington, didn't get it done. But there's 2 games they win at home that I think entering the week, most people thought they would lose in Pittsburgh and in Minnesota. Which of the 2 wins was more impressive, beating Pittsburgh or beating Minnesota?
Well, for me, it was Pittsburgh only because it was far more well-rounded. I mean, lost in the fact was how good the Eagles' defense was. The Eagles' offense, by and large, couldn't do anything with that Minnesota defense, and that's kind of what we expected. Carson Wentz obviously had his worst game as a professional. Number of turnovers. I think, it was such a Herculean effort by the Eagles' defense early when you had the 2 turnovers. The Vikings started drives in the red zone twice, and the Eagles' defense stood up and didn't allow them to score. That was turning out early to be the typical Minnesota game where they were just going to overwhelm you offensively, defensively, give the offense short fields, take a quick 10-0, 14-0 lead, and the game was over. But the Eagles' defense didn't allow that. They intercept Sam Bradford in the end zone. They come back with a forced fumble, a strip sack. It was just a tremendous effort by the Eagles' defense. Against Pittsburgh, it was more of a well-rounded. The offense played well, the defense dominated. So overall, I would say that game was a little better just because it was more well-rounded.
What do you think yesterday's turning point or play of the game really was? Because that game was really hard to gain momentum because of the way the ball was going back and forth. I mean, the turnovers. I mean, you look like it was like a Cleveland-Jacksonville game there, not two teams that think they're playoff teams.
Yeah. I thought the turning point was early when Rodney McLeod intercepted Sam in the end zone. I thought the Vikings were going in. Generally, even though they don't run the ball, Matt Asiata is very good in short yardage. They stuffed him at first. Then they force him to throw the football in triple coverage. Brandon Graham absolutely destroys the right tackle to force the interception. I think if the Vikings score a touchdown, it's a completely different game because all of a sudden that defense is playing with the lead, and it just changes everything. And you kind of saw how confused Carson Wentz was early. Vikings didn't blitz yesterday. We talked about all their A-gap looks and how complicated their blitz packages are on third down. By and large, they played coverage. And Carson had a really, really difficult time with it. And it doesn't surprise me because the Eagles receivers are not good. And we see that each and every week, and they had trouble getting separation. So it was going to be a long day if the Eagles had to play from behind. So that was the turning point. And the other one is obviously after the 3-0 lead, Josh Huff returning it for a touchdown. Those were the two big plays in my estimation.
Yeah, I would agree to some extent, but I almost thought the difference in the game was right before that, where the guy from Minnesota picks the pass off and somehow didn't return it for a touchdown. The fact that he doesn't, because if he gets in there, it's a pick six, and you're already like, oh my gosh, this is going to be a long day. I don't know how he didn't score on that play, but then that turns into the interception in the end zone. So it's a combination of how does Minnesota not get in on that interception there and put that, because I think if he scores there, that feeling of, this is going to be a tough day at the office, and they get right in, and then boom, that turns into that interception, which I think they end up fumbling back at some point. I mean, that first quarter, it just seemed like
then they turned it right back, and then the Vikings turned it right back.
Right, but if they return that for a 6, you almost feel like not only, did they score there, but it's just like that feeling of this defense is so good, you're not going to be able to move the ball. They get the pick 6, but you're right, the kickoff return, it's only the second one in the whole league this year, and they're both by Philadelphia, Huff and Smallwood. What a difference maker that ends up being. And then it seemed like after that, the Eagles' defense just absolutely, and you're right, John, you go back to when the Eagles have the lead, that defense is so different. Most teams, but this one specifically that's predicated on pressuring so much, and getting that lead really changed things, I thought, in that game.
Oh, sure. And you're right. It is every team. Yeah, every team would prefer to play with the lead, but more so not only Philadelphia, Minnesota needs to play that way as well. So both of those teams yesterday are very, very comfortable playing with the lead. But, hey, I think Jim Schwartz really understood what affected Sam Bradford, and it was that roll coverage. And conversely, I thought Norv Turner was, and he's known, he calls a lot of very, very long plays, and what I mean by that is they take a long time to develop. As far as double moves on the outside, he wants to use play action. He wants to push the football down the field. And when it became evident that the Vikings tackles weren't going to be able to hold up, he just didn't adapt. He just didn't change during the game. And from that point forward, the Vikings offense didn't have a chance. And one of my things in the quick hits, I think everybody was lauding Doug for the going for it on fourth down at the end of the first half. It worked, but I thought it was a terrible decision because I'm thinking to myself, this offense can't move the football, and it was just an egregious decision because if you turn the ball over,
right,
and Minnesota gets the ball to 44, you give them life. They only need 20 yards, 30 yards to get in field goal range. Who knows? Could be a pass interference. We all know how the NFL works. So that's one of those things I often say in life. Sometimes you make the right decision and bad things happen. Sometimes you make the wrong decision, good things happen. From a strategy standpoint, I thought that was a big mistake from Doug Peterson.
Yep, and that one there, yeah. And then somebody asked earlier, we had a text message that wondered why they went for 2 after the penalty. You know, they end up going for 2.
I like that.
And I said I don't have a problem with them going for the 2 in that situation, but I think because that showed, hey, look, if we can't get a yard, I always say if you can't get a yard, you don't deserve to win games. I mean, you're not a playoff team if you can't get one stinking yard. Show your team that, hey, we can go get that yard, boom. And then on the other side, though, you're right. I mean, to go for it there, I'm thinking to myself, all I could see is a ball getting tipped in the air, him getting sacked or something ridiculous because he had no timeout. But that being said, overall, Doug Peterson, I thought he had 2 rough weeks, was much better this week.
Yeah, and I thought a lot of that had to do with, as I said, a lot of it had to do with Jim Schwartz and his game plan. But, you know, we know how people are with the NFL. They overreact to certain weeks. This was we talked about it kind of last week, styles make fights. This was, in a weird way, a good matchup for the Eagles, especially at home. Now, as we look forward to Sunday night against Dallas, they're going to have to do it a different way. Because, A, you're on the road. B, you're not going to have that pass rush. You go from perhaps one of the 2 or 3 worst offensive lines in football to the best, and it's going to have to be a more well-rounded game like we talk about Pittsburgh. The offense is going to have to contribute because the Dallas defense is that team's weakness. So that's the NFL. You have different matchups every week. The Eagles took advantage and did a tremendous job where they had the advantage and the better players. They did a really good job sort of mobilizing that and showing it off.
Hey, you wrote a piece about Brandon Graham. When he got drafted, the Eagles, people maybe don't forget because of the fact that they did trade up to get him. And there was a guy on the board that many people wanted who's turned out to be pretty darn good out in Seattle. Also a defensive end in New York that was doing pretty good early. And Graham was kind of swept under the rug as a bust. He absolutely deserved the game ball yesterday. I mean, he was everywhere. And talk a little bit about how he factored into yesterday's game and how he is now becoming a guy that you've got to take notice of almost every week.
I wrote about he's been the Eagles' best defensive player, and that includes Fletcher Cox this season. He has been the Eagles' most dominant defender, and NFL coaches always talk about game wreckers and the fact that there are certain guys that can wreck your game plan offensively and defensively, even if you have a good plan. And that was Brandon Graham yesterday. He destroyed the Vikings' right side time and time again. Even when he didn't get there for the strip sack, like I said, he was the one that caused the Rodney McLeod interception. Rodney made a good play, but that was all Brandon Graham. And I think that was an early turning point in the game. He was tremendous, and he's been consistently good all season. And people, I wrote, we always talk he's playing at the Pro Bowl level, and we put that sort of caveat on it because his history hasn't been that way, although he's played out of position for years under Chip Kelly. Now that he's in a comfortable environment again, he's been one of the best edge defenders in the NFL, and he's deserving of being called one of the 3 or 4 best players on this team.
Hicks and Bradham, I thought, played for the first time. Not that Hicks has had a bad year. It just last year he seemed to stand out every week. Yesterday was the first time that he seemed like maybe he's had an adjustment going from 3-4 to 4-3. He's one of the few guys that this defense maybe isn't better for, where the other guys, the 4-3 is better. Yesterday was the first time I thought Hicks really was a factor, and Bradham, I mean, when they signed Bradham, I had told the listeners, you're going to really like this guy. I thought he was underutilized or valued as a signing, but it's apparent that he is a big factor on this defense.
Yeah, I mean, I thought Jordan first. I thought Jordan's had a good year until the Washington game where nobody played well defensively. He played poorly. But beyond that, but you're right, the splash plays weren't there. And things were a little splashier, and maybe because in the switch from the 3-4 to the 4-3, it's not designed for him to make as many splash plays. That generally comes from the guys up front. So that's part of it. But he's been very, 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 very sound for the most part if you take out the Redskins game. But yesterday he showed up. And you're right about Bradham. Bradham, and I'm one of those, I'm very surprised how much they've gotten out of Nigel Bradham because he had never played like this. Even when he was under Jim Schwartz before, he was a heck of a lot better than he was under Rex Ryan in Buffalo, but it wasn't like he was a world beater. And he's just done a tremendous job. And the bigger surprise yesterday, he showed up on the blitz, and obviously you're not going to see that from week to week because the Eagles don't rely on it that much. But before that game, before the Vikings game, he's been tremendous basically all year in pass coverage. And that part has been a very, very big surprise to me.
Yeah, a couple of real quick hits here, John. I know you'll be in studio for the full show tomorrow, so we'll be able to go in depth on a lot more. But, last week I discussed that the Eagles, when Andy was here, they had Brian Westbrook, mediocre receivers. They've got mediocre receivers. They don't have Brian Westbrook. They got to figure out what they want to do with this run game because they're getting bupkis from those wideouts.
Yeah, they are, and it's difficult. I mean, there's just not a lot of skill position people here. There just isn't. And Doug's gone with the committee approach. Ryan had some decent runs at time. It was okay. It's been like the running game pretty much for the whole year. It hasn't been terrible. They usually get a run here or there. Fumbles the ball late again, which didn't matter because the Vikings were out of it by that point. But still, it's not something you want to see. And I don't think the Eagles coaching staff has a ton of confidence in Ryan Matthews. But where else do you go? We all know Darren Sproles is limited as far as how many touches you can give him. Wendell Smallwood looks like he's got far more juice in his legs and can give you a jolt, and occasionally does. But let's be realistic about that. Rookie running backs in this league tend to struggle in pass protection and catching the football. And Wendell's not good at either of those two things. So it limits his opportunities to be on the field. Wendell's been on the field something like 40-something snaps. I don't have it in front of me, and he's run the football on 60 or 70% of the snaps he's been in the field. So real quick, people are going to start to figure out, hey, if Wendell's out there, they're going to give him the football because he can't do anything else but run it. I'm not sure where the Eagles can go with this running back position. At this point, it is what it is unless Ryan Matthews can figure it out and get something going.
Yeah, and the fumble, he's fighting for yardage there in that situation. I guess, we all know, hey, you're in the lead, just let the clock run. But that's two fumbles late in games. This one doesn't end up hurting them. The first one, obviously, can you imagine he doesn't fumble that ball? We're talking about a team right now, John, for all intents and purposes, 5-1, and it's a lot different feel than 4-2, even though 4-2 with the arrow pointing up into Dallas. Pretty good. Plenty more to discuss on this game. And then, of course, we'll look ahead to Dallas week starting tomorrow when John's in the studio. Pete's back tomorrow as well on the Sports Bash 97.3 ESPN. All right, John, we'll see you tomorrow, pal.
All right. Thanks, Mike.